Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Pay Entry's weekly webinar. Today, we're going to go ahead and get started. Just as a little reminder, remember that these webinars are intended for educational purposes only, and while we do hope that you learn new information, the trainers that present these webinars are not attorneys. Therefore, all information provided during the presentation and the Q&A session should not be construed as legal advice. All right, so now that we got that out of the way, good afternoon. My name is Brianna Grimes, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar today. We are going to be talking about how to use disciplinary forms effectively. Now, you can refer to this specific process as corrective actions, write-ups, an accountability program, whatever your company really wants to refer to. However, essentially what we are going to be talking about today, regardless of what you call it, is really just how to hold your employees accountable to your policies and their jobs while using a consistent disciplinary process. Just as a reminder, if you do have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them into the question box and they will be addressed during the Q&A session at the end. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump in. All right, so today we're going to be talking about the types of disciplinary forms and why we use them. We'll talk about the steps of the progressive disciplinary process and kind of what each step is and why they're important. We'll talk about using discipline effectively, both in communication with your employees as well as just overall as an organization. And then we will finish off with some do's and don'ts of discipline, just some general best practices that you can really practice in your everyday management style. And then we'll finish up with a Q&A session. All right, so we're going to start by talking about the different types of disciplinary forms that you can use in your organization to hold your employees accountable. The first type of form is a coaching conversation, which is more of an informal documented warning. Now, this form is typically used when an employee is having issues with performance or attendance or things like that, but it has not necessarily become a consistent issue, or it's not something that's necessarily broken any policies just yet, but it's on that track. Now, maybe they're getting close to your threshold for absenteeism, or maybe they've been a great performer, but all of a sudden they're just not meeting deadlines and their performance has declined. Coaching conversations are sometimes called seek to understand conversations, and they're used in these instances. And they're aptly named because that's exactly what they're purposed with. You want to have a conversation with the employee to let them know what the issue is and that you're seeking to understand why they're having these issues. We're trying to get to the bottom of it so it doesn't have to get to the corrective action phase because we don't want that. Now, the next type of disciplinary form is a corrective action form. And this is the most common type of disciplinary action form, and it really tends to be the pillar of most organizations' performance management. Corrective action forms are usually used in tandem with a progressive disciplinary process that most companies utilize. And this is where employees are moved through each of the stages of discipline if their behaviors or their issues are not corrected. Those stages tend to be the verbal, the written, the final written, and then finally termination. Another type of disciplinary form that's not used quite as often is called a performance improvement plan. Now, this form is usually used as a substitute for the corrective action form because it addresses multiple performance-related issues. Corrective action forms are more so used to address one or two categories of performance issues, whereas the performance improvement plan, or PIP as we call it, is really used to address an employee's overall performance issues. And it really gives them a strict deadline between 30 and 90 days to correct the behaviors. And then finally, a variant of the PIP is the Manager Improvement Plan, also known as the MIP. And this form is used specifically for manager accountability in order to address managers' overall performance and their management issues. So it's going to be a little bit differently formatted than accountability for a frontline employee because managers tend to have more responsibilities and therefore the form is adapted to that use. So for those of you that are not familiar, we're going to briefly review the steps of the progressive disciplinary process. So step one tends to be a coaching or an informal warning. And we talked about these briefly on the last slide, but you almost always want to start with a conversation to really just find out what's going on with this employee. Now, during this conversation, you want to try to figure out the root cause of the issue and especially pay attention to information that could trigger an FMLA or an ADA process. Remember that if the employee is sick or if they're disabled or if they're caring for a family member who is sick, then these things may be causing performance or attendance issues. You want to immediately provide them information for FMLA or for an accommodation through ADA if they're eligible for either. This is really an important step in this process to ensure that you do not increase the likelihood of a discrimination claim or an FMLA or ADA claim against your organization. So these are key things to listen for in that particular or that first performance conversation. Now, step 2 is a documented verbal warning. Now, this can also be step 1, depending on if you choose to skip the coaching conversation, which is really at your discretion as a manager and as an organization. Now, the documented verbal warning almost always gets managers confused because someone along the historical timelines of HR decided to name this a verbal, and that's usually what we hear it referred to as a verbal warning, which infers that it's not documented, and this is not true. Every step in this process must be documented. None of it should be 100% verbal because it provides no protection to the company if you do it that way. So therefore, I always encourage clients to call this step a documented verbal warning so there's no confusion as to whether or not it should be documented. And this is really where you're going to start the formal disciplinary process. And you would use your disciplinary form in this manner. So if you don't have a disciplinary form, you might be able to find some online. I know there are templates out there, although I would recommend having an HR professional or an attorney look them over just to make sure that there's no language on them that can get you into trouble or that might be just not as protective to your organization. And this is something that Kathy and I can also assist you with. If this is something you are developing for your organization, we can help you develop the policies and the forms. So if you are interested in our services for that, let me know at the end of the webinar and I can get you some more information on what that looks like. And then we move on to step 3, which is a written warning. So you're going to provide the employee with a documented verbal, let's say for attendance, for example, and they still have attendance issues over the next 30 days. So you're going to meet with them again and let them know that you're going to move on to that next step, which is a written warning. And these steps can be skipped, again, don't forget, but only if the behaviors are egregious enough to warrant it, and you will have to justify as to why you skipped it. The burden of proof is on the employer to give a good enough reason. Step 4 is their final written warning, meaning that they need to change their behaviors and comply. Otherwise, the next step will be termination. And then finally, step 5 is termination, where they are let go for failing to correct their behaviors. So that is kind of the main process for the progressive disciplinary actions. Now, next, we're going to take a look at a few examples, and I actually have some polls set up, so you guys are going to kind of participate a little bit and let me know what you think. So we're going to take a look at a few of these examples so you can kind of see this disciplinary process in theoretical practice. So let's look at this first example. Sally has been with ABC Corporation for 6 months and has had no performance or attendance issues during her introductory period. Beginning 2 weeks ago, Sally has started showing up to work late or asking to leave upwards of 30 minutes early. How should the manager handle this? So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. So I want to know how you guys think the manager should handle Sally's situation. Should they do a coaching conversation, a documented verbal, a written, or should they do nothing? Give you guys a couple minutes to cast your votes. All right, it looks like pretty much everybody has weighed in. So it looks like a lot of you did a really good job. So 94% of you said that it should be a coaching conversation. Let's take a look at what the recommended answer is and why it's the best answer. So you guys were right. The recommended answer is a coaching conversation. Why? Because this is abnormal behavior for Sally, and we need to have a seek to understand conversation to really find out what's going on and see if she may need an accommodation under the ADA, if that's something that may apply. Now, keep in mind, Sally has only been with the organization for 6 months, so she would not be eligible for FMLA. So at this point in time, when we talk to Sally, we're really just looking for those ADA red flags. All right, let's look at another example. So Henry has been with ABC Corporation for 5 years, and he was recently transferred to a new team under a new supervisor. On multiple occasions, Henry has refused to follow instructions from his new supervisor because they've only been with the company for 1 year and he's been there for 5. How should this supervisor respond to Henry? Let me put the poll question up here. So I want to know what you guys think. Should he have a coaching conversation, a documented verbal, a written warning, a final written, or do nothing? All right, we got quite a few votes in on this one, a little bit more participation, so we have some strong opinions here. All right, so it looks like we're a little bit split actually. So the vast majority of you said we should move to a documented verbal, a couple of you said a coaching conversation, and a little less than 15% of you said we should do a written warning. So let's go ahead and check out what the recommended answer is and why. So the recommended answer for this situation is actually an escalation to a corrective action written warning level. And the main reason is because Henry's behavior towards his supervisor is not acceptable. It's basically flat out insubordination, which is usually something a little bit more egregious than, attendance issues or some not meeting deadlines and things like that. Now, supervisors do have the discretion to skip stages in the process in order to enforce the severity of the behaviors if employees are not responding to other managerial techniques. So as a manager, you do have the discretion of kind of choosing what type of manager you want to be. But assuming that this manager has had conversations with Henry and, gone into the new team and said, hey guys, really excited to be a part of this team. Let me know if you have feedback, and tried to make that transition, pretty normal as you can be. And if Henry is still being insubordinate and not responding, that is something that he could definitely escalate to a written warning. All right, let's take a look at another example. So Jackie has been late to work 13 times, absent 11 times, and left early 6 times in the last 6 months. Jackie's supervisor wants to put Jackie on a final written warning for attendance. Should they do this? So this is going to be a simple yes or no answer. I want to know your guys' opinion. Should Jackie's supervisor put her on a final written warning for attendance? All right, a lot of you weighed in on this one, and we are split a little bit, but there is a vast majority, about 61% of you said yes, put her on a final written warning, and the remaining 40% of you said no, don't do that. So let's take a look at what the recommended answer is and why it's the best answer. So the recommended answer is actually no, this is not advised, and this trips up managers a lot. So the main reason why this is the recommended answer is because a supervisor's lack of accountability toward their team during the last 6 months does not warrant an escalation in this process because it's not the employee's fault that their managers has not hold them accountable. Accountability needs to be an ongoing process, and managers who wait until 6 months have passed to address any issue, whether it's attendance or not, they're really the ones at fault for not handling it sooner. In this case, Jackie's supervisor should really only write Jackie up for incidents in the last 30 to 45 days max, and then go from there. So if in the last 30 to 45 days, Jackie's only been absent twice, called out maybe 2 more times, and then left early once, Jackie only has 5 attendance incidences and not the 20 or 31 here that we see in the example. All right, let's try one more example. All right. James manages a team and is not consistent with his documentation practices. James would like to put Sean on a written warning because he's given Sean multiple undocumented verbal warnings. Should HR approve his request for the written corrective action? So this is another yes or no question. I want to know, do you guys think that HR should approve the request to put Sean on a written corrective action? I'll give you guys a couple minutes. All right, we're getting quite a few responses here. I like it. All right, so we are a little split, but it's actually a very similar split. So we've got a 60-40 split again. So about 60% of you said no, HR should not approve, and the other 40% of you said yes, HR should approve. So let's take a look at what the recommended answer is. So the recommended answer for this situation again is no, HR should not approve this request. Regardless of the number of verbal warnings an employee receives, documentation is key to any disciplinary procedure because there's no documentation that James has talked to Sean about his performance. This really puts the company at risk if James is lying or if the conversations were not clear to Sean that he was having performance issues. Sometimes we get managers that are not great at communication and they may think that they're telling an employee, hey, you've got an issue, you need to fix it. And the employee may not be getting that from the conversation. The employee may go right over their head because the manager's really not being direct in terms of their verbal warnings. So that's one of the main reasons we want documentation to really outline that, yes, you have a performance issue or you have an attendance issue. We're putting it in a documented verbal, and the whole process is very consistent and succinct. So in this case, if James is only doing undocumented verbal warnings, we're not going to escalate this to a written corrective action. If James wants to put him on a written verbal finally, that is 100% acceptable, but we're not going to escalate this to a written because James hasn't done his due diligence as a manager to really document this process. All right, thanks for your participation on that, guys. Okay, so we've looked at a few examples of how to handle employees using the progressive disciplinary process. But what happens if the employee has a lot of performance issues? You know, what if they have excessive attendance issues, they can't work with the team, they're not meeting deadlines, and on top of all that, they've got a bad attitude? Well, you should not necessarily put all of that on a corrective action form because corrective action forms aren't really built for that type of employee accountability. Corrective action forms are really built for kind of a singular corrective action in terms of, you know, what you're going to hold them accountable to. It's either performance or it's attendance or it's insubordination. It's usually one or two things maximum. So this brings me to the next step of the process that can either replace entirely the steps that we just talked about, or it can follow any of the steps we just talked about. So remember the PIP and the MIP that I talked about earlier. These methods are used when an employee is having multiple performance or policy issues that are all contributing to their lack of success in their job. So this is a document that is definitely more customized than a corrective action, and it allows for a great deal of discretion by management in terms of how they want the employee to proceed and what the timeline really is as far as expectation goes to allow them to improve on their behaviors. Essentially, this document outlines all of the performance issues that they are having that are affecting their work. It provides detailed examples and descriptions of what their behaviors should look like, and it provides them anywhere from 30 to 90 days to meet those expectations, depending on how much is being expected of this employee. Now, failure to meet these expectations usually results in termination, and that's usually outlined in the document. So one of the most common questions that I get from clients regarding disciplinary processes is how big do we have to be to start using them? And I want to start by saying that there's really no specific employee count for you to implement these corrective action processes. These processes are not federally or state mandated. However, these processes do help mitigate liability with things like federal and state laws that may affect your business. So a good rule of thumb that I use is that any employer with 5 or more frontline employees or any employees in California, Washington, Oregon, New York, New Jersey, Arizona, Colorado, or Nevada should use some form of documented disciplinary procedure. Now, the second question I usually get right after that question is, why should we even use these forms? Where is your recommendation really coming from? Well, there are 5 main benefits that employers gain from having developed processes like this in place, and I'm going to share those with you to demonstrate exactly why these forms should be used and why they're a huge pillar of HR. So the first is that this process provides important documentation. Remember that documentation is a golden word in HR, and primarily the main reason for the states that I've listed above has to do with documentation. The states that I listed above have legislation that favors employees over employers. And what that means is that the burden of proof for just about everything is on the employer. Now, what this means is that if any issues come down to their word against yours, the employee is probably going to win unless you have some form of documentation to defend your position. This goes for all sorts of potential issues, including wrongful termination cases, discrimination, and ADA claims, just to name a few. Now, disciplinary documentation helps to protect the organization as a whole, and it helps mitigate your risk when it is implemented correctly. Key here has to be implemented correctly and fairly across the board. Now, the second reason is that having a documented process in place, really it demonstrates consistency and fairness to all of your employees. It makes it very difficult to argue a discrimination or a favoritism claim if you have the same process being applied fairly by each manager equally to all employees, and any of those employees that don't meet expectations. So now there can be room for discretion as the managers see fit in terms of, when do we escalate, when do we not escalate, how many conversations do we have. But for the most part, the process and the overall foundation should be the same across the board, and that really helps you mitigate your risk in this category. Now, the next reason is that these documents, once completed, outline performance expectations and policies both clearly and concisely. So this helps us to avoid the "I didn't know" paradigm that happens from time to time. Now, again, going back to the burden of proof being on employers, you have to prove that the employee was made aware of what was expected of them, so they can't say, "Well, I didn't know this was expected of me. That's not fair." And unfortunately, having them sign a job description and a handbook is not enough. This person has been with your organization for as little as 6 months. It's not generally best practice that it's reasonable to expect them to know their handbook and their job description backward and forward. So a constant reiteration of policy and procedures and expectation is required, and that's where that disciplinary process comes into play. Now, this next one might surprise you, but fair and consistent processes that hold employees accountable actually increases team morale. Now, some of you might be thinking, Brianna, that does not make any sense. Like, what are you talking about? But it does, I promise, and we have studies to show it. So most employees who value their work, their job, and their company want to be held accountable, and more importantly, they want their peers to be held accountable. Why? Because we live in a democratic society that values capitalism. Employees want to be rewarded for their efforts, and they don't want to have to do extra work for those that slack off without getting them disciplined and for not doing their fair share. So employees really don't appreciate, for the most part, they don't appreciate socialism in the workplace. They don't want the few overachievers to do 80% of the work while the manager's favorites get by with doing absolutely nothing. So eliminating these types of practices or even circumstances that could potentially lead to these practices increases your team morale overall, because employees know that they're going to get recognized for their good work that they do, and employees who can't hack it in the workplace aren't going to be a part of the team for long. And what this does, it creates a solid working team that trusts and relies on one another and trusts their manager to be fair. And finally, reason number 5 is that this process ensures that employees who are not a good fit for your company don't remain in your company. Having a body in a role for the sake of having it there is a mistake that a lot of employers tend to make because they don't have a good disciplinary process in place. They keep employees for months or even years without holding them accountable. And when they're afraid to change the terms, or they do decide to hold them accountable, they don't do it. They're very passive about it. And this creates what we call in the HR world as a detractor. This is someone who tends to actively detract from your company culture, productivity, and overall success. Usually, they do it through a very negative attitude or their inability to work well with others. I'm sure all of you can think of at least one person, either in or previously in your organization, that fits that description. Now, having a disciplinary process in place really ensures that these types of employees don't stay in your organization long enough to cause it any significant harm, which is what we want to do. Studies have actually shown that having one active detractor in your organization for 1 year can cost companies up to 3 at or above expectation performers. So you're possibly losing 3 great employees because you don't have a way to hold one bad employee accountable. And we're seeing this a lot more, and it's becoming more of an issue with the millennials as they start to take over the workplace majority. They are a generation that does not want everything to be based on tenure with a company. They want to be appreciated and acknowledged for the work that they do, the ideas that they bring to the table, and the collaborations and the teamwork that they tend to promote because of the way their generation was raised. Detractors are the direct opposition of what these millennials stand for. And companies that don't manage their detractors are going to lose out on skilled employees that are coming from the millennial bucket. All right, so what does an effective disciplinary conversation even look like? And how does the corrective action form play a part? Well, there are 5 main steps to an effective disciplinary conversation. Step 1 is stating the purpose of the meeting. Be direct and let the employee know why they're there. It's as simple as saying, we're here to discuss your recent absenteeism issues. It's best not to beat around the bush. When accountability is practiced consistently across your company, it should be no surprise to the employee when they're called into a meeting to discuss discipline. And it does not do the manager any good to try to pretend like the conversation is not a disciplinary conversation. Step 2 is to explain the policy. The most effective disciplinary conversations can support why the behaviors are unacceptable using company policy. This is one of the reasons why practicing what is in your employee handbook is so important, and another reason why updating your employee handbook is so important. When you're holding the employees accountable, you need something to hold them accountable to. For example, your policy might be that your company allows up to 6 absences in a rolling 6-month period. Now you have an expectation to base your whole disciplinary conversation around. It's no longer the manager being mean or picking on someone. It's simply the manager doing their job and upholding company policy. And it really takes the pressure and personal bias out of the conversation, so the employee doesn't take it as personally. Step 3 is providing examples in order to demonstrate the behaviors that have been violated by the policy or in the policy. So these examples really need to be clear, and again, they need to be documented. Try to include dates and details and descriptions as much as possible. For example, telling the employee that they called out on February 25th, March 1st, March 14th, April 2nd, April 20th, April 25th, April 30th, and May 1st is a lot more effective than just telling them that they're absent a lot. Step 4 is bringing the conversation back to the corrective action process by clearly explaining which step they're being placed on and why. That way, they're clear as to what the repercussions are for the behaviors you talked about. For example, you can let the employee know that they're being placed on a documented verbal corrective action due to their excessive attendance issues that violate the company policy. And step 5 is resetting expectations going forward. During this portion, the manager must reiterate the expectations to the employee and have them sign the corrective action form, acknowledging that they have had the conversation and they understand these expectations going forward. For example, you could say something like, going forward, you should not have any call-outs until your current attendance incidences fall off. Future incidents may lead to additional disciplinary actions. Now, this is the basic structure of an effective disciplinary conversation. A lot of the information you will need to reference, like the policy and the specific behaviors, is what is going to be written up in that corrective action form. So as you're developing a corrective action form, it should follow this basic disciplinary conversation in terms of how your form is structured. Now we're going to wrap up by looking at some general do's and don'ts of discipline to give you a better idea of what best practices you can implement. So let's start with the do's. Do reference specific examples and policies. Don't be vague or opinionated when it comes to these conversations. Leave your personal opinions of the person and the policies out of the conversation. Do listen and be empathetic. Sometimes employees don't say anything, and other times they have an excuse for everything. But regardless of how the excuses might sound, just be respectful and listen to what they have to say. Also, listen specifically for FMLA or ADA red flags. Remember that if they're taking time off for a qualified reason under either FMLA or ADA regulation, then they would be that they are eligible for. They could either have a leave or an accommodation that you would need to provide to them. So you should reach out to your manager or HR immediately and provide that employee the information on their rights so you don't put the company at risk. Do have another manager present at the meetings. I always recommend, when possible, having another manager present during these conversations so there is a witness, especially if you have an employee with a history of either a bad attitude or dishonesty. It protects you and the company. And I always recommend having a manager of the same sex as the employee whenever possible, just to mitigate risks on that front as well. Do ask if they have any questions. Be sure to open up that channel of communication and allow them the opportunity to ask you questions or get clarity, or even just tell you that they don't understand the policy or it's really hard for them to follow the policy. Allow them to have that conversation with you because it really helps to build on your work relationship with them. And finally, do remove your feelings from the conversation, regardless of whether you like this person or their job, or you don't like, the company, you don't like your job as a manager. Your main purpose is to hold them accountable and manage them in their role with this company. Your feelings toward the person, their work ethic, their personality, the company as a whole doesn't matter. So leave it out of the room when you have these conversations. Focus on just the facts. Now let's take a look at the do nots. Do not attack or accuse the employee. Always use language that is factual and does not sound accusatory in nature. This tends to escalate the issue and only increases your potential liability more. Do not add incidents more than 45 days old to the write-up, and don't bring up things that you've already coached them on before. The purpose of these conversations is to give the employee the chance to improve. If you're always bringing up old incidents from an old corrective action that you've already addressed, then you're not giving them the opportunity to improve their behaviors. Additionally, you need to remember from our example that if you are the manager, or if you as the manager have failed to act and hold your team accountable, that does not mean that you get to add all the incidents since the beginning of your management time to correct them on a corrective action form. Any incidents past 45 days are usually off the table for corrective actions because they should have been handled when they occurred if the manager was practicing the disciplinary process correctly. Do not explain consequences like they are a threat. I hear this all the time in employee complaints during investigations, that their managers threaten to fire them if they miss work again. Please do not do this. You can let them know during the expectation segment that future incidents of whatever behaviors will be grounds for discipline, but do not ever threaten firing someone. It's super unprofessional, and it creates a disgruntled employee who is now feeling threatened by their manager and the company, and this puts the company at risk. Also, do not force them to sign the document. Legally, they don't have to sign it if they don't want to, but I will let you in on a little trick that almost always works. If the employee says that they don't want to sign the document, tell them that's fine. They can choose not to sign it. Then write beneath the signature line, "Employee refused to sign," and then ask them to initial that they refuse to sign the document. 9 times out of 10, they will initial their refusal to sign. What does that do for you? What does that matter? They still didn't sign it, right? Well, now you have their initials on a document showing that they were provided the document and they were present during the conversation, which is really the only documentation that you need to protect your company from a situation where an employee will try to deny that they were ever given these warnings. So it's really all you need. Also, do not damage the trust between yourself and the employee. Use this conversation as a tool to enhance your relationship with your employee by trying to understand them and coach them. Try to avoid being the parent that's ruining the teenager's life, and try more to be like a coach who's trying to help the player understand how to play the game. And finally, do not bring up issues that are not written on the corrective action. Focus on the issues that you have written down. If you're giving them a write-up for attendance, don't talk about their attitude or their work quality. You need to stick to what's on the write-up. Those issues might be better for another conversation down the line, or you may need to put this person on a PIP if they don't improve their overall performance. All right, I know that was a lot of information, and I hope it was helpful information. So if you did not get the chance, feel free to take a second right now and ask any questions that you have via the question box. And remember, just as a reminder, this presentation was recorded, and it will be available to watch again. So to do that, you can visit www.payentry.com and hover your mouse over the webinars tab at the top and click webinar recordings. The most recent recordings will almost always be on top, and these are usually posted within 24 hours of the live webinar. You will also be emailed a copy of the webinar recording tomorrow afternoon to your registration email. There's also a survey that follows this webinar. So please feel free to leave your feedback and let us know if you have any suggestions for topics that you want to see us talk about sometime on our webinar schedule in 2021. All right, let me see what questions we have. Someone asked, do you have forms available? We have ours, but may not be in compliance. If you have forms and you would like us to review them, we'd be more than happy to do that. If you are a payroll client for pay entry, then we can look at those for you, no charge. So if you want to send those over to either Kathy or myself, we can look over them for you and edit them. I don't have any templates available, usually because the corrective action forms, at least the PIPs and things like that, are pretty customized to your organization. But if I can see if I can find a template that isn't too complex, and I can send it to anybody interested. So if you are interested in a template, feel free to shoot me over an email. Next question was, can I see the screen of do's and don'ts again, please? Yeah, I can put that on at the very end if you want, or if you guys want, I did include the handout for all of the PowerPoint slides. So you should be able to, under the handouts tab on the GoToWebinar portal, you should be able to download all the slides and you'll have access to all the slides for this presentation. If for whatever reason you can't download it, just shoot me an email and I can send those over to you. All right, it looks like we don't have any other questions. So thank you guys for your time today. I really appreciate it. I hope you learned a lot of great information. If you still have questions, feel free to send it to my email listed at the bottom of the slide. Again, if you're interested in a template or you need a copy of the PowerPoint, please feel free to send me an email and I can get that over to you. Remember, next week we are going to be talking about the new COBRA rules from the American Rescue Plan Act that President Biden signed. So Kathy is going to be talking about if you offer any type of healthcare and you have to offer COBRA, what are the new rules and do they apply to you? So feel free to join us next week and register for that webinar on our website. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.